to welcome back to this radio station Dr. Terry Coopers, who is a psychiatrist and professor emeritus at the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California. He is an expert on the intersection of mental health and incarceration, and especially, and has focused many years and has studied and advocated against the use of solitary confinement. He is the co-author of the book Ending Isolation. The Case Against Solitary Confinement is co-authored with Christopher William Blackwell and Deborah Zalesny. I should have asked about that name before we began, and Juanetta Harris. Dr. Coopers, it's great to see you again.
It's great to be on with you, Mitch.
And if I just would have looked at my notes, I knew I should have asked about that. Deborah Zalesny?
Zalesny, I think is correct.
Okay. You know, Eileen Offenderry, who did our news for many years here, once told me, if you don't know the name, just act like you do, and just, it doesn't matter if you mispronounce it. They will notice if you try to pronounce it if you don't know, and if you mess it up. Instead, I just let everyone know, so I didn't follow her advice. It is good to have you back here, because one of the really important interviews that I've done in my time doing this program, Letters and Politics, was with you. I feel like I don't remember exactly when it was, but I feel like it was some decade ago or so. And it was when we talked about what happens to the mind during solitary confinement. And to me, it was an instruction of how the mind works and what extreme isolation does to the mind. And then I just have used that ever since to think about isolation in general and the importance it is to be in contact with other humans, because we are human. We are a social species, and our brains need each other to sort of create a shared reality. And I'm going to get into all of that in a moment, but I first want to begin because you have this book that I had just mentioned, Ending Isolation, The Case Against Solitary Confinement, is being published this week, and you are going to be at an event with my good friend and colleague Kat Brooks, who is host of Law and Disorder, on Thursday, September 4th at 6 p.m. at St. John's Presbyterian Church in Berkeley. And we'll give these details quite a bit through this hour, but the reason I rarely ever begin by talking about someone's event, but this event is unique. It begins at 6 p.m., but what actually begins at 6 p.m. is an exhibit.
That's correct, Mitch. It's a double event. It is both the discussion of the book, as you mentioned, Ending Isolation, and it's the launch of a national bus tour, the Journey to Justice bus tour, which is sponsored by Unlock the Box, a national organization, and Look to Justice. The bus tour is part of the campaign to end solitary confinement. So it'll be the bus will be starting in Berkeley and travel across the country to New York and Washington, D.C.
What was happening on this bus?
There are a number of exhibits. It's an educational project, so there are interactive exhibits. There's a library on the bus. There is a mock solitary confinement cell, which will be up and running on Thursday at our event. So the 6 o'clock time is when the exhibits on the bus are open. The book will be on sale at 6. And then at 7:30, we're going to have the public forum with Kat Brooks as the host.
Again, this is going to be on, is it KPFA is involved in this event too.
KPFA is the sponsor, yes.
And again, that is at the St. John's Presbyterian Church in Berkeley on September 4th at 6 p.m. I'll give those details throughout the hour. Tell me about this isolation box on the bus.
Well, it's a public education. You know, what goes on in prison is horribly secret in our society. People don't pay any attention. It's just, lock them up and throw away the key. So the project has been to tell the public what goes on in solitary confinement. The best people qualified to do that are the people who are in solitary confinement, and in fact that's what the book is about. It has 4 authors. I'm one of them. I'm very proud to be. 2 of the authors are currently in prison, Chris Blackwell in Washington State and Juanetta Harris in Texas. and 36 prisoners contributed their stories to the book. That's a very courageous act because they're subject to retaliation for speaking out to the public about the horrors of solitary confinement, and there are many horrors. So that's the story the book tells. The book, we also explain what's going on to halt solitary confinement and what we need to do from this point forward.
What is solitary confinement?
Well, the United Nations definition of solitary confinement is a requirement that one spend 22 or more hours per day in a cell, be cell-fed, be cut off from all social interactions except for the officers passing a food tray through a slot in your door. And you're almost entirely idle. You're not allowed much inside the cell. You cannot participate in programs. In some states, they allow the prisoners to have an iPad, which has limited prison-approved courses on it or shows, and that's it. You sit alone in a cell. There's some attempt at recreation, usually very minimal, and recreation typically happens in a little cage, not much larger than a cell, with no athletic equipment. So you're almost entirely isolated and idle, and that's what causes immense human damage.
When is solitary confinement used?
Unfortunately, I can't answer that because it's just used all over the place for all kinds of reasons. It was supposed to be, and the public image is for the worst of the worst, for prisoners who cannot be controlled any other way than to isolate them. That is totally a lie. In fact, the people in solitary confinement are usually there for very minor rule infractions, or, for instance, for fighting. Fighting is epidemic in prison. I mean, in men's prisons, it's a dominance hierarchy. Tougher men sort of challenge new prisoners to fight. If the new prisoner fights, they either get beat up or they make a good showing in the fight, but they get a disciplinary report and they're sent to solitary. That happens to just about all prisoners, so it's not the worst of the worst. Most people are in solitary for very minor rule infractions, and that puts a lie to the idea that it's the worst of the worst.
Do most prisoners, and I guess it will vary from state to state. Some states have outlawed solitary confinement. Our state of California has not, though you've been working on it for a long time. But is that a common? Do most prisoners, let's just say in the state of California, will they face solitary confinement?
Just about every prisoner is in solitary confinement for some period of time during their term in prison. Some people spend years, many years. Albert Woodfox was one of the Angola 3 at Louisiana's Angola prison. He spent 44 years in prison, was released several years ago, spent a few years on the outside, and then died of cancer that he got inside prison. So some prisoners, and it tends to be prisoners of color, black and brown particularly, and people who are socially conscious. They understand what the prison system is about, the relationship of modern prisons to slavery, the racial discrimination that goes on, and the political uses of prisons. Those people end up in solitary confinement because they're a threat to the ruling order.
What's the stated reason for using solitary confinement? Is that there's no other way to control this person in prison?
That's correct. It's for security and safety in the prison, which is totally false. All research shows that solitary confinement does not reduce violence or rule violation or gang participation in prison. In fact, it makes the problem worse. And the reason it makes the problem worse is because solitary confinement causes immense human damage and destroys people's ability to resolve tensions and difficulties peacefully. I call it the decimation of life skills. That happens to just about everybody in solitary confinement, and that's why it's entirely wrong to say that it's needed to enforce safety. What it really does is it enforces compliance, or that's the goal. The correctional authorities create a monster, solitary confinement, where really it's torture going on there, isolating and making idle people for months and years. And what the prison authorities do is they create a torture inside the prisons, which then allows them to control the rest of the prison population, who are all afraid of going to solitary. For instance, when women are sexually abused in prison, and usually it's staff who do the abusing, as we found out at Dublin, the federal prison near the Bay Area, the women are put in solitary confinement while the complaint of sexual abuse is investigated. This causes women not to report sexual abuse. So they're reporting this sexual abuse because they're going to be sent to solitary confinement for maybe months or longer while their complaint is investigated.
What's the stated reason for doing that? Is it in the name of trying to protect them from...
That's right. They claim that solitary is protection, but the real protection would be to immediately discipline the officers. That's usually who does the sexual abuse. The officers who are alleged to be doing the sexual abuse. In the community, police are put on leave while they're being investigated for sexual abuse or excessive use of force. In prison, the officers are not put on leave, but the woman is sent to solitary, presumably for her protection. But as I say, the damage outweighs any protective function. The real protection would be to leave the women to be among other women who support them, have social connection, and then not have the psychiatric symptoms that evolve in solitary confinement.
Terry Coopers, you are a psychiatrist. You've been studying solitary confinement for a long time. Tell me about your journey and studying about solitary confinement. What does it mean to study and research? How does one do that?
Well, there are many ways to do it. My particular experience has been as an expert witness. I'm a forensic psychiatrist. I, for most of my career, had three components to my work. One was my clinical practice in an office and in hospitals. One is teaching, where I've taught at the Wright Institute since 1981. And the third has been forensic psychiatry. At first, and this was in the 1970s, I would testify about the damaging effects of crowding in our prisons. And the prisons, there was a boom because of the law and order tendency and the 3 strikes and the longer sentences. The prisons became overcrowding, and there was good research showing that crowding increases the rate of violence, the rule violation, psychiatric breakdown, and suicide. So I would testify in court about those issues as well as sexual abuse. In the 80s in the United States, with the same time that social welfare safety net programs were being cut, the neoliberal strategy, and at the same time law and order was being enhanced and longer sentences occurred, the authorities in prison, the prisons were out of control. Remember the San Quentin Six, the Attica Rebellion, and the authorities didn't know what to do. I and a number of experts like me said, well, I know what to do. Decrease the prison population. It's crowding that's causing the problem. And increase rehabilitation, which was being cut as part of the law and order phenomena. They did not heed our advice, and they said, we know better what to do. We're going to lock up a lot of the troublemakers. So they started building entire cell blocks or prisons dedicated to solitary confinement. This was the age of Supermax. My testimony, the reason that lawsuits were brought on behalf of prisoners changed in the 1980s from challenging the crowding to challenging the solitary confinement, because that's where most of the damage was happening. I became an expert because when I testify in a case, I do an investigation. The warden has to open the door and allow me in to go anywhere and talk to anyone.
Including in a solitary confinement?
Yes. The court orders that since I'm going to testify, I need to have some basis for testifying.
Yeah.
So I get to go in. For me, that means that I'm one of the rare individuals who sees what's going on in prison, and I have a responsibility to come out and talk about it, which I do in court. I testify as an expert witness. But then I also write and I speak and I talk to legislatures. So that's how that evolved in my life.
Well, what's it like to go into that box?
Well, the first I would say, years that I did that, I was horrified to see people treated the way they were. There would be blood on the walls. There would be, I would see people in a cell with no mattress and no bedding. They have to sleep on a concrete platform. The temperature might be freezing or might be unbearably hot. They would often have their water turned off. There were beatings. They do what's called a cell extraction. When someone's in isolation, they're already at the worst punishment the correction system has to offer. If they misbehave, and the misbehavior is going to be yelling at an officer or insulting an officer, and they'll get a ticket for disrespecting an officer. If the officers want them to do something, often it's about returning a food tray. The prisoner typically will say, look, there's bugs in my food. I'm not returning my tray. I want to speak to someone. I want to speak to an administrator or the warden about the awful food that's inedible. And the officers will say, that's a refusal. We're going to extract you. They will assemble 5 or 6 officers in what they call riot gear or safety padding. They have helmets. They have gas masks. They'll come and they'll shoot immobilizing gas, pepper spray, into the prisoner's cell, close the port, the food port, and it's a solid metal door. So the prisoner is left to cough and be irritated by the immobilizing gas. And then they will gather outside the door, and 5 officers will go in, each one assigned to grab a limb, one of them having a shield, who leads the way, and they'll open the door and go in and slam the prisoner against the wall and take him down and put him in handcuffs. Obviously, a lot of prisoners get very badly hurt in the process. That is called a cell extraction. It's further torture inside what is already torture, just being isolated 24 hours a day.
How do these people who are in solitary confinement respond to you when you enter? What's that like when you approach someone?
I am known as their expert. In other words, the plaintiff in the civil lawsuits that I'm involved in are the prisoners themselves. And prisoners have a communication system. They know there's a lawsuit going on. They know the attorneys who are bringing me in. And so they are going to cooperate with me. They're going to be relieved that they have a human being to talk to. And so I get a very honest response from them, and that's how I do my research.
This is Letters in Politics, and we are in conversation with Dr. Terry Cooper, psychiatrist and professor emeritus at the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California. He is the co-author of the book Ending Isolation, The Case Against Solitary Confinement. It is co-written with Christopher William Blackwell, Deborah Zalesny, and Juanetta Harris. It is being published this week. There will be an event for our listeners in the San Francisco Bay Area here in Berkeley. It's called The Ending Isolation, The Case Against Solitary Confinement. It's going to be on September 4th at 6 p.m., starting at 6 p.m. to see the exhibits. It's going to be at St. John's Presbyterian Church in Berkeley. My colleague, Kat Brooks, host of Law and Disorder, will be participating. We'll also have Angela Davis is going to be there.
She's recorded a message for us. She can't be present.
Okay. And then some of your co-authors will be joining by... At least one of them will be.
That's correct. Chris Blackwell will be on the phone, and he's able to do that. So we'll hear his voice. We won't be able to see him.
All right. I want to get into this and really dive into this. What happens to the mind when somebody is put in solitary confinement?
The damage is immense. It starts with anxiety. There's severe anxiety. People have panic attacks. They feel like they can't breathe. They have trouble thinking, and often that becomes paranoia. They become despairing and depressed. The suicide rate in solitary confinement is enormous. 60% of the suicides, successful suicides in prison, happen in solitary confinement settings. Thinking is disturbed. There's a lack of concentration. They have trouble with memory. So prisoners in solitary tell me, I say to them, if I was in solitary, I think I would spend all my time reading and writing, because that's all you're allowed to do. And they say I can't do that because when I read something, I forget what I read the page before, and there's no coherence. And that's what they lose. They lose coherence. Paranoia, for instance. We're all a little bit paranoid. I'm a psychiatrist, so I say that with a degree of seriousness, that I walk into a room and two people are talking, sort of whispering on the far side of the room, and I have the private thought, oh, they're talking about me. They don't like me. They're saying something bad. And I walk up to them and they turn and they smile and warmly greet me. And I think to myself, I was being paranoid. Or I call somebody and leave a message and I don't get a call back, a friend. And I see them a while later and I say, I called you a couple of times, you haven't returned my call. And they say, oh, I'm sorry, I've been sick and I haven't been attending to my messages. And privately, I have the thought I was being paranoid. I believe that paranoia is part of our epistemology. Partly how we know the world is we form sometimes paranoid ideas, sometimes grandiose ideas, and then we reality test. Reality testing is mostly about talking to other human beings. So I think somebody's mad at me, and I talk to them, and I say, I think you're mad at me because of such and such. And they say, Terry, I'm not mad at you. Where'd you get that? And I think to myself over and over, well, I was being paranoid, and I correct my course. You can't do that in solitary confinement. There's nobody to talk to except guards who bring you your food tray and put you in manacles and walk you to your next appointment. And you really can't talk to them. So if you're in your solitary cell talking to nobody, it's not silent. There's a lot of noise, the slamming of doors, clanking of boots on the hallway, but it's no meaningful communication. And you hear some loud joking and insults coming from down the hall. You know, it's the officers. Your thought is, just like when I walk into that room with two people talking, they're plotting to come in here. They're going to do a cell extraction, the process I just described, and they're going to beat me up, maybe kill me. All right, you have that thought, and it's a passing thought if you're in a normal social situation because you do some reality testing and you figure out you are being paranoid. In a solitary cell, there's no way to reality test. You have no way to know whether those officers are coming to kill you. And therefore it rattles around in your mind, and it sort of informs a lot of other thinking. You get more anxious, you get angry, and you don't know what to do with all of these feelings. You're just overwhelmed by them. And that's a lot of the damage of solitary confinement.
This reality testing is so deep and profound, because I feel like you were talking about it on a very conscious level. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I feel like it happens unconsciously too. I feel like I can make myself conscious of some of it. For example, just talking to you right now, I'll see how you respond to what I say, my questions that I ask. I'll even look up for sort of facial cues, like, does this make sense? Does this make sense? Am I sounding normal here? And you're affirming that I am. I mean, whether I am or not, I don't know, but you're at least making me feel like I am, right? And I feel like even on an unconscious level, we're constantly, without realizing it, checking our reality with other people.
Yes, and you've got it absolutely right. And you know, one of the things that's happened since our previous interview, which was quite a few years ago, when I wrote my previous book about solitary confinement, is brain studies. We know a lot about what goes on in the brain. For instance, returning vets with PTSD, we've studied their brains up and down. We do PET scans, which is photon emission tomography. We do functional MRIs. And we've figured a lot out. For instance, very simply, I'll say, the temporal lobe, where the limbic system is, and the amygdala, I think these are widely known terms, controls emotions, particularly anger. And if the limbic system fires a lot, the person is overwhelmed with anger or anxiety or some kind of emotional state, even sadness. The prefrontal cortex is another area of the brain right over the forehead, right under the forehead, and that controls our cognitive functioning, our moral sense, our ability to contemplate, to understand the repercussions of our actions. In normal life, there's a balance between the limbic system in the temporal lobe and the cognitive or executive function in the prefrontal cortex. What we find from all of the brain studies is that after someone is traumatized, and the same changes occur when someone is in solitary confinement, the temporal lobe takes over, and there's sort of unrestrained emotion. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex is weakened. There's less firing in the prefrontal cortex. And by brain theory alone, we assume the person is overwhelmed with feelings, particularly destructive feelings, anger, agitation, and that kind of thing. And that goes on in solitary confinement. That matches my qualitative findings when I talk to people in solitary. They talk about anger building. They're angry about being put in solitary. Usually they'd assume it's unfair. And when I look into cases, there's quite a lot of unfairness. For instance, black people are regularly put in solitary by white guards, and there's a lot of racism involved. So they're correct about that. But what they tell me is that their anger is out of proportion to what they've rationally figured out they have to be angry about. They just get increasingly angry. It seems to be a function of being in solitary confinement. In fact, our brain studies show why that's the case, with this growth or hyperactivity in the limbic system and underactivity in the prefrontal cortex.
I think of Tara Brach, who writes about the limbic hijacking. Sometimes when our emotions take.
That's a good term, yes.
Kind of take over.
So now let's go back to the officers joking and cussing at the end of the hall. How is a prisoner supposed to figure out what's going on there? Well, if in his brain, physically, there's a heightening of emotion and a weakening of cognitive functioning, that adds to the paranoia. That he just gets scared or gets angry, and he can't quite figure out what's going on. And what all of us do in a situation like that is we talk to people. But that's exactly what's been deprived in his case.
As a species, as an animal, we're known. We are a social species.
That's correct. Our reality testing is totally social. And if we deprive people of that reality testing, they have psychiatric consequences. And that's what we see to such a great extent that internationally, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture says that spending more than 15 days in solitary confinement is torture. And it's exactly because of this kind of confusion and being overwhelmed with emotion that happens.
I mean, what you're taking away with solitary confinement, I'm obviously talking to somebody who's against solitary confinement, so maybe this should be so surprised. This is where I'm being led, but it sounds like the logical conclusion here is solitary confinement is taking away the essence of what it means to be human.
That is absolutely correct. And that then has lasting damage, so that people leave solitary not more peaceful. They may be more compliant out of terror of going back to solitary, but they're not more peaceful, and they tend to get into trouble, both inside prison and then after they're released from prison.
And it's this mental drift that happens. We begin to drift mentally, and we're talking about paranoia, but maybe other ways we drift as well, because we have nothing to check it upon, no one else to check their reality upon what we think we are experiencing. And I can't help, we're talking about an extreme here, right?
Yes.
Solitary confinement.